The most dangerous lie is the one that has been repeated for so many years that nobody thinks to question it anymore. I first noticed something was wrong because of the sound. Every weekday before sunrise, while the rest of my ranch still slept beneath a blanket of Texas morning mist, I could hear the steady hum of engines echoing across the eastern pasture. At first it was only a few vehicles, then dozens more, until an endless line of headlights stretched across the gravel road my grandfather had built more than 70 years ago. I stood on the ridge behind my equipment barn with a hot cup of black coffee warming my hands, watching families begin another ordinary morning. Parents drove children toward school. Contractors hauled trailers loaded with equipment. Delivery vans bounced over the old limestone bridge that my father and grandfather had rebuilt countless times after heavy spring storms. Nobody hesitated. Nobody looked around. Every driver crossed my ranch as though they had owned the road their entire lives. My name is Ethan Carter. I am 47 years old, and my family has worked this Texas ranch for 3 generations. Long before there were paved neighborhood streets, decorative entrance signs, or rows of suburban homes stretching across the eastern horizon, my grandfather cleared cedar trees with borrowed machinery and built that gravel road by hand because it was the only practical connection between our ranch headquarters and the county highway. My father spent decades maintaining every foot of it, teaching me that a road is not simply dirt and stone. It represents responsibility, history, and respect for the land beneath your boots. That lesson stayed with me long after he was gone. For years, I never questioned the growing traffic because I assumed the county must have created a public connection while I was busy running cattle, repairing fences, replacing water lines, and managing thousands of everyday responsibilities that come with ranch life. But something about that endless stream of vehicles refused to leave my mind. There were simply too many people using what I had always believed was our private ranch entrance. Curiosity finally outweighed routine. Later that morning, I launched my small survey drone, intending only to inspect fencing damage during the previous week's storm. The drone climbed steadily into the cool blue sky, while the ranch slowly unfolded beneath it. Cattle wandered through open pasture. Wind rippled across tall native grass. Then the camera reached the eastern property line, and everything changed. The live video feed showed every neighborhood street inside Willow Creek Estates flowing toward one narrow connection before reaching the county highway. I replayed the footage twice because I thought I had misunderstood what I was seeing. I had not. Every single vehicle leaving that neighborhood traveled across the same gravel road my grandfather built generations earlier. The drone continued circling overhead while I stood completely still beside the weathered concrete posts where an old steel ranch gate had once stood before we removed it years ago to make room for larger equipment. Those forgotten posts suddenly felt less like relics and more like silent witnesses waiting for someone to remember why they had been placed there in the first place. I looked from the drone controller to the endless line of morning traffic disappearing into the distance, and one uncomfortable question settled into my mind. If that road had never actually belonged to the neighborhood, then 60 families had unknowingly built their daily lives around a piece of land that had always belonged to mine. That evening, I parked my pickup beside the old equipment barn and walked alone toward the weathered concrete posts that had quietly stood at the edge of the ranch for longer than I had been alive. The fading sunlight stretched across the pasture, casting long shadows over the same gravel road where hundreds of tires had passed every week, without anyone questioning who had built it or who actually owned it. Standing there, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice describing the summer he bought this ranch after returning home with little more than determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone around him. There had been no paved highways leading to the eastern fields, no heavy machinery waiting to make life easier, and certainly no suburban neighborhood beyond the horizon. The road existed because he created it one load of limestone at a time, using borrowed equipment and countless hours beneath the Texas sun. My father inherited more than land when my grandfather passed away. He inherited responsibility. Every spring, after heavy rains carved deep channels through the gravel, we spent entire weekends repairing washouts together. As a boy, I learned how to spread fresh stone with a shovel before I was old enough to drive. My father always insisted that caring for the ranch meant paying attention to the smallest details because neglected problems eventually became expensive ones. Before we finished each repair, he would stop beside the old steel gate at the county highway, rest one hand against its weathered frame, and quietly remind me that property lines were not created to divide neighbors. They existed so everyone understood where respect began. Years later, we removed that old gate because modern ranch equipment had become much larger, and leaving the entrance open made moving hay trailers, tractors, and livestock far more practical. The gate disappeared, but the heavy concrete posts remained exactly where my grandfather had anchored them decades before. Until that afternoon, I had rarely given those forgotten posts a second thought. Now they seemed to carry more meaning than ever before. I knelt beside one of them and brushed away years of dust, dried grass, and loose soil with my hand. The rough concrete surface looked almost untouched despite decades of changing seasons. It struck me that boundaries could be forgotten by people without ever disappearing from the land itself. Back at the ranch house, I spread old family photographs across the dining room table. One faded picture showed my grandfather standing proudly beside the original steel gate shortly after completing the road. Another captured my father repairing the limestone bridge after a flood, smiling despite being covered in mud from head to toe. Every photograph told the same quiet story. The road had always belonged to the ranch because the ranch had always cared for it. Later that night, I opened county mapping websites, comparing modern aerial imagery with historical photographs available through public archives. The subdivision had expanded steadily over the years, but one detail remained unchanged across every image. Every neighborhood street curved toward the same gravel road crossing my property before reaching the county highway. There were no alternate exits visible from any direction. That realization settled heavily in my mind as I closed my laptop. If what the drone had shown me was accurate, then the issue was far bigger than a simple misunderstanding about one ranch road. An entire community had unknowingly placed its daily routine upon a foundation that my family had quietly maintained for generations, and somewhere between those old photographs and the modern neighborhood, an important piece of the story had been lost. The next morning, I decided that memories alone were not enough. My grandfather's stories, my father's photographs, and the old concrete gateposts all pointed in the same direction. But if I wanted the truth, I needed evidence that would stand on its own. Shortly after sunrise, I drove into Willow Creek Estates for the first time with a purpose beyond simple curiosity. It was a beautiful neighborhood. Wide sidewalks curved between neatly maintained homes. Children waited at bus stops with backpacks almost bigger than they were, and neighbors waved to each other while walking their dogs beneath rows of young oak trees. Nothing about the community suggested conflict. In fact, watching ordinary families begin another normal day made me hope I was wrong about everything. If the road truly belonged to the neighborhood, I would gladly accept the answer and move on. But as I slowly drove through the subdivision, one detail became impossible to ignore. Every single residential street gradually funneled toward the same exit. No matter which direction I turned, every route eventually pointed back toward the gravel road crossing my ranch before reaching the county highway. I parked near the community clubhouse and quietly observed the steady morning traffic for several minutes. School buses followed the same path. Delivery trucks followed the same path. Utility vehicles followed the same path. There was not a second entrance anywhere that I could find. That afternoon, I requested a meeting with the homeowners association instead of sending letters or making accusations. A few days later, I returned to the clubhouse where I was introduced to Victoria Reynolds, the homeowners association president. She greeted me professionally with a confident smile and invited me into a conference room overlooking the neighborhood entrance. I explained that my family had owned the ranch bordering the subdivision for generations and that recent aerial images suggested the community's primary exit might actually cross private property. Rather than becoming defensive, she listened carefully while reviewing the printed drone photographs I had brought with me. When I finished, she calmly explained that residents had used the road for years without interruption. Emergency vehicles, utility companies, delivery services, and county contractors all recognized it as the neighborhood entrance. From her perspective, everything indicated that proper legal access had been established long before either of us became involved. I nodded because I understood exactly why she believed that. If I had purchased a home there, I probably would have assumed the same thing. I replied that long years of uninterrupted use and legal ownership were not always identical. which was why I hoped we could jointly review the official records before making assumptions in either direction. Victoria thanked me for raising the concern, but explained that the homeowners association attorney believed the subdivision's documentation had already resolved those questions many years earlier. We ended the meeting respectfully, shook hands, and wished each other a good afternoon. As I drove back toward the ranch, I realized neither of us had treated the other like an enemy. We were simply standing on opposite sides of the same unanswered question. She trusted decades of uninterrupted use. I trusted generations of family history. Somewhere between those two beliefs lay a truth that neither of us could prove through conversation. Alone, only surveys, county records, and the land itself could decide which story had been quietly waiting beneath the surface all these years. 5 days after my meeting with Victoria Reynolds, a certified envelope arrived in my mailbox bearing the letterhead of a law firm representing the homeowners association. I carried it inside, placed it on the kitchen table beside my coffee, and opened it slowly. The letter claimed that the neighborhood had established permanent rights to continue using the ranch road because it had served as the community entrance for many years without interruption. It demanded that I acknowledge those rights and warned that legal action would follow if I attempted to interfere with access. I read every page twice before folding the documents neatly and setting them aside. Outside my kitchen window, the same gravel road stretched toward the county highway exactly as it had every morning since my grandfather first completed it. The land looked peaceful, unchanged, and completely unaware that a legal dispute had quietly arrived at the front door. I never considered responding with anger because anger would not answer the only question that mattered. Ownership could not be settled by assumptions or confidence. It had to be established by evidence. The following morning I met with a local real estate attorney whose family had practiced property law throughout the county for decades. I spread old family deeds, aerial photographs from my drone, historical pictures of the ranch entrance, and the homeowners association letter across his conference table. He examined each document carefully before asking a simple question that immediately changed the direction of everything. When was the last certified boundary survey completed on the eastern property line? I admitted that no modern survey had been performed since long before the subdivision existed. He nodded thoughtfully and explained that opinions from either side would accomplish very little until licensed surveyors verified every property corner using recorded monuments and county records. Before leaving his office, I hired both his legal team and a respected surveying company with extensive experience throughout the region. Early the following week, survey crews arrived carrying advanced measuring equipment, historical plats, and detailed county coordinate information. For several days, they worked methodically across the eastern boundary of the ranch, uncovering old iron monuments buried beneath grass and carefully comparing every measurement with decades of recorded property descriptions. Watching them locate markers placed generations earlier felt almost like watching forgotten pages of family history emerge from the ground itself. Meanwhile, life beyond the ranch continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Parents drove children to school. Delivery trucks crossed the gravel road. Utility crews completed routine work inside the subdivision. The residents probably had no idea lawyers, surveyors, and county records were quietly determining whether the entrance they depended upon actually matched the legal history beneath their tires. That thought remained with me every evening as I watched another steady line of vehicles disappear toward the county highway. I never blamed the families living there because they trusted the information provided when they purchased their homes. If anyone deserved careful examination, it was the paperwork created years before they ever arrived. As the final survey crews packed their equipment into their trucks one warm afternoon, my attorney called to tell me the county archives had located several historical subdivision records that might finally answer every question neither conversation nor assumptions had been able to resolve. Standing beside the weathered concrete gateposts once again, I realized the land had already told its story. Now it was simply waiting for the documents to catch up. 3 days later, my attorney called just after sunrise and asked if I could come to his office before noon because the survey team had completed its report and the county archive had delivered every historical document we requested. The tone of his voice was calm, but I could tell something important had finally surfaced. By the time I walked into the conference room, the long table was covered with rolled survey maps, certified copies of property records, subdivision plats, aerial photographs, and handwritten notes connecting decades of ownership history. The licensed surveyor stood beside a large map mounted on an easel and carefully explained every measurement before reaching the conclusion that changed everything. The gravel road had never crossed into public property. Every foot of it remained inside the legal boundary of my ranch exactly as my grandfather's original deed described more than 70 years earlier. The iron monuments uncovered along the eastern boundary perfectly matched the recorded coordinates preserved in the county archives. There was no discrepancy in the property line. There was no surveying error. The land had remained exactly where it always had been. My attorney then opened another folder containing the original subdivision development records. As we reviewed page after page, one detail became impossible to ignore. The developer had proposed obtaining a permanent access easement across my family's property during the early planning stages of the neighborhood. Draft correspondence showed preliminary discussions had taken place many years before I inherited the ranch, but the final recorded documents contained no executed easement, no signed agreement, and no instrument transferring any permanent right of access. Whether the negotiations had failed or simply been forgotten, nobody could immediately determine. What mattered was far simpler. The easement everyone assumed existed had never actually been recorded with the county. We spent the next several hours confirming the conclusion from every possible angle. My attorney searched for additional filings. The surveyor compared historical plats with modern satellite imagery. County staff verified that no later amendment had ever been entered into the official records. Even the title research produced the same answer. Despite decades of uninterrupted use, there was no recorded legal document granting permanent access across the ranch road. I sat quietly absorbing the weight of that discovery. Surprisingly, I did not feel victorious. Instead, I thought about the families I had watched. Driving to work every morning. They had purchased homes believing every necessary legal requirement had already been completed long before they arrived. Their confidence had been built upon paperwork they had every reason to trust. The real mystery was how such an important issue had remained unnoticed for so many years. Before leaving the meeting, my attorney explained that uninterrupted use by itself did not automatically erase recorded ownership, and that several legal questions, including any potential claims based on long-continued use, still required careful evaluation before anyone took action. He recommended moving slowly, documenting everything, and allowing the legal process to unfold through proper channels instead of making emotional decisions. As I drove back toward the ranch that afternoon, I passed the familiar line of vehicles crossing the gravel road once again. Nothing looked different from the outside. Children still laughed inside school buses. Delivery drivers still followed their navigation systems. Neighbors still waved to one another without realizing the foundation beneath their daily routine had quietly shifted. The forgotten concrete gateposts waited beside the entrance exactly where my grandfather had placed them decades earlier, and for the first time I understood that they had never been remnants of the past. They had been silent evidence all along, patiently waiting for the truth to catch up with the land. The survey results answered the biggest question, but they did not tell me what to do next. That decision carried far more weight than any maps spread across my attorney's conference table. We agreed that every step from that point forward had to be deliberate, transparent, and fully supported by the law. The first recommendation was simple. Do nothing until every document had been independently verified. Over the next 2 weeks, my attorney coordinated with the county survey office, a civil engineering firm, and the title researchers to make certain there were no overlooked filings, pending applications, or historical agreements hidden somewhere inside decades of public records. Every answer pointed in the same direction. The ownership boundary had never changed. No recorded easement existed. Even after reviewing potential claims based on long-continued use, my attorney explained that no immediate action should be taken without first completing the proper legal process. I appreciated that advice because I had never wanted to create hardship for families who believed they were simply driving home. My disagreement had never been with the residents. It was with an assumption that had quietly replaced documentation. Once every review was complete, we prepared a formal notice explaining the survey findings and inviting the homeowners association to discuss a lawful solution before any physical changes occurred. Copies were delivered through legal counsel rather than emotional conversations because written records leave far less room for misunderstanding. Several days passed without a meaningful response beyond acknowledging receipt of the documents. Instead, additional legal filings arrived repeating the association's position that the existing entrants should remain available while the dispute continued. My attorney responded calmly, requesting that all future discussions remain focused on certified records rather than assumptions. At the same time, we submitted applications to the county for permits related to restoring the original ranch entrance exactly where it had historically existed. Engineers inspected drainage near the roadside ditch. County officials reviewed traffic visibility from the highway. Utility companies confirmed that no underground infrastructure would be affected by reinstalling a gate between the original concrete posts. Every approval followed the ordinary process used by any property owner making improvements on private land. Nothing happened overnight, and that was exactly the point. Good legal decisions rarely move quickly. They move carefully. During those weeks, I often walked to the old entrance in the evening after finishing chores around the ranch. The weathered concrete posts remained planted firmly in the ground, surrounded by tall grass that swayed gently beneath the warm Texas breeze. I remembered helping my father remove the old steel gate years earlier, believing we would never need it again because the open entrance made daily ranch work easier. We had stored the gate frame behind the equipment shed instead of hauling it away for scrap. Out of curiosity, I uncovered it beneath years of dust, surface rust, and stacked fencing supplies. The hinges were still solid. The heavy steel frame still fit perfectly between the original posts. I ran my hand across the weathered metal and realized that my grandfather's workmanship had outlasted decades of changing ownership around the ranch. The forgotten gate had become another quiet piece of evidence waiting for its moment. By the time every permit, inspection, and legal review had been completed, I knew exactly what came next. I was not preparing to block anyone out of anger. I was preparing to restore a lawful boundary that had existed long before the first house in Willow Creek Estates was ever built. The restoration began before sunrise on a calm Monday morning. A county inspector arrived first, followed by the licensed contractor who had been hired to reinstall the original steel gate using the same concrete posts my grandfather had set into the ground decades earlier. Every permit had already been approved, every inspection scheduled, and every document was available for review inside a folder resting on the seat of my pickup. There were no surprises waiting for anyone that morning because we had intentionally followed every required legal step. I stood quietly beside the entrance while the contractor carefully positioned the weathered gate between the old hinges. Fresh hardware replaced only the parts that time had worn beyond repair. The steel frame itself remained exactly as my father had left it years ago, carrying scratches, faded paint, and the unmistakable signs of generations spent protecting the ranch. Watching that familiar gate swing smoothly for the first time in years felt less like building something new and more like restoring a forgotten piece of family history. Shortly after 7 o'clock, the first vehicles from Willow Creek Estates approached the entrance expecting another ordinary weekday commute. Instead, drivers slowed as they saw the restored gate standing across the gravel road. Nobody appeared angry at first. Most simply looked confused. Several residents stepped out of their vehicles, looked toward the county inspector, then toward me, trying to understand what had changed overnight. The inspector calmly explained that work had been completed under valid county permits on privately owned property and that any legal questions should be directed through the appropriate channels already identified in the public notices. The conversations remained respectful because everyone involved understood that emotions could not alter recorded property boundaries. Before long, Victoria Reynolds arrived carrying a folder of documents almost identical to the one my attorney had assembled weeks earlier. She walked toward the entrance with measured confidence, greeted the county officials politely, and asked to review the inspection paperwork. The inspector handed her copies of the permits and survey references while my attorney, who had arrived earlier that morning, provided the certified boundary survey and title research supporting every decision that had led to this moment. Victoria studied each page much longer than I expected. For the first time since our initial meeting at the clubhouse, I noticed uncertainty replacing certainty. She quietly asked whether every historical record had truly been reviewed. My attorney answered by pointing to the survey monuments, the recorded deeds, and the county archive references that had already been independently verified. No voices were raised. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. The silence that followed carried far more weight than an argument ever could. Behind us, the old concrete posts that had witnessed decades of unnoticed traffic now framed the restored gate exactly as they had during my grandfather's lifetime. Around us, residents waited patiently inside their vehicles, gradually realizing the issue was not about a sudden decision made overnight. It was the result of years of overlooked documentation finally catching up with reality. By mid-morning, the Homeowners Association attorney contacted my legal team, requesting an emergency meeting later that afternoon. The tone of the conversation had changed completely. Instead of insisting that assumptions were enough, they wanted to discuss certified records, possible solutions, and future access. As I watched the morning sun rise higher above the ranch, I understood something my father had tried to teach me years ago while repairing that same gravel road. The strongest boundaries are not enforced by loud voices or locked gates. They are sustained by patience, careful preparation, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing the truth has been standing in the same place all along. That afternoon, we gathered inside a county conference room instead of a courtroom, and I considered that a victory before anyone even spoke. Around the table sat my attorney, the Homeowners Association attorney, Victoria Reynolds, two county officials, the licensed surveyor who had completed the boundary work, and a civil engineer responsible for reviewing possible long-term access solutions. Stacks of maps, engineering drawings, title reports, and certified survey documents covered nearly every available surface. For the first time since this entire situation began, nobody argued about where the property line existed because every independent record now pointed to exactly the same conclusion. The conversation shifted from debating ownership to solving a problem that affected dozens of families. Victoria began by acknowledging that the association had relied upon development records provided years before most current residents purchased their homes. She explained that the board had never intentionally ignored private property rights because they genuinely believed permanent access had already been secured during the original construction of the subdivision. Listening to her, I realized we had both spent weeks defending what we sincerely believed to be true. The difference was that certified records had finally separated assumptions from facts. My attorney proposed several options that balanced legal ownership with practical community needs. The civil engineer presented drawings showing how a properly recorded easement could be established while also identifying space for a future secondary entrance connecting the subdivision directly to another county-maintained roadway. County officials explained that additional infrastructure would require permits, engineering approval, environmental review, and coordination with nearby property owners, but they agreed the proposal was technically feasible. I made one point perfectly clear. I had never wanted to isolate the neighborhood or create unnecessary hardship for families simply trying to reach work, school, or medical appointments. My only request from the beginning had been simple respect for documented property rights and a lawful agreement that reflected reality instead of assumptions. Victoria looked across the table and quietly admitted that after reviewing every survey, title record, and historical filing herself, she could no longer dispute the ownership history. The association attorney then announced that the pending lawsuit would be voluntarily withdrawn so both sides could negotiate a permanent recorded solution rather than continue an expensive legal battle built upon incomplete historical information. The atmosphere inside the room changed almost immediately. Conversations that had once centered on legal positions turned toward maintenance responsibilities, insurance requirements, future road improvements, emergency vehicle access, and long-term planning. Engineers discussed drainage. County officials reviewed traffic studies. Lawyers drafted language protecting both the ranch and the neighborhood from similar misunderstandings in the future. Hours passed surprisingly quickly because everyone had finally begun working toward the same objective instead of opposing one another. As we left the meeting that evening, Victoria paused beside the courthouse steps and thanked me for choosing patience instead of confrontation. I told her that my grandfather always believed neighbors solved lasting problems by respecting facts before opinions. She smiled thoughtfully and replied that perhaps the subdivision should have asked more questions years earlier. Driving home across the ranch at sunset, I passed the restored steel gate, standing quietly between the original concrete posts. It remained, exactly where generations of my family had placed it, not as a symbol of exclusion, but as a reminder that even the strongest communities depend upon foundations that are honestly built, carefully documented, and mutually respected. Over the following months, the conflict that had once seemed impossible slowly transformed into something neither side had imagined during those first difficult weeks. The Homeowners Association formally withdrew its lawsuit, and together we finalized a recorded easement that clearly defined where access existed, who was responsible for maintaining the roadway, and how future improvements would be approved. Every page was carefully reviewed before being signed and recorded with the county so that no family, no future ranch owner, and no future homeowners association board would ever have to repeat the uncertainty that had brought us together. Construction on a secondary neighborhood entrance began the following year after engineering studies, environmental reviews, and county approvals were completed. Watching heavy equipment build a permanent public connection felt strangely satisfying because it represented a solution instead of another argument. Once the new entrance opened, the familiar line of morning traffic gradually shifted away from the gravel road crossing my ranch. For the first time in decades, sunrise returned to the quiet rhythm I remembered from childhood. Instead of listening to dozens of engines echo across the pasture, I heard meadowlarks calling from the fence posts, the distant sound of cattle moving toward the water tanks, and the wind sweeping through the native grass exactly as it had when my father walked these same fields beside me. The restored steel gate remained standing between the original concrete posts, but it no longer represented conflict. It simply marked the entrance to private property with the clarity that should have existed all along. Every now and then I still unlocked it for ranch deliveries or welcomed utility crews working under the new legal agreement. And every time the hinges swung open, I thought about my grandfather building that road one load of limestone at a time without ever imagining that generations later it would become the center of an important lesson about responsibility and respect. Several months after everything had been resolved, Victoria Reynolds stopped by the ranch one afternoon carrying a framed aerial photograph of the neighborhood and surrounding countryside. The picture showed the new public entrance, the restored ranch gate, and the winding gravel road connecting them like chapters of the same story. She told me the association planned to display a copy inside the clubhouse as a reminder that accurate records mattered just as much as good intentions. I thanked her, and together we stood quietly looking across the pasture where the afternoon sunlight reflected off the limestone road my family had maintained for so many years. Nothing about the land itself had changed. The boundaries had never moved. The road had never moved. Only people's understanding had changed once patience, careful research, and documented facts replaced assumptions. Looking back now, I realized the greatest surprise was never discovering where the property line actually stood. The greatest surprise was learning how easily generations of ordinary people can inherit a misunderstanding without ever questioning it. That experience reminded me that protecting property is not about winning against neighbors. It is about preserving trust through honesty, documentation, and respect so the next generation inherits certainty instead of confusion. Every morning when I passed the old concrete gateposts on my way across the ranch, I remember my father's words that property lines are not meant to separate good people. They exist so everyone understands where responsibility begins. In the end, justice did not arrive with raised voices or dramatic victories. It arrived through patient preparation, verified records, lawful decisions, and a simple truth that had been waiting in the Texas soil all along.